Well, a very good morning to you on this Women's Day. And one of the key discussions we're going to be having today is around that topic. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women in the workplace as they had to carry the burden of unpaid childcare as children stay home due to school closures. So when jobs were shed in the economy, women in the hospitality and tourism sectors lost work. While women account for 45% of the workforce, they make up over 66% of the unemployed. Let's get you some more perspective on this special Women's Day broadcast from former CCMA Commissioner Dr. Meyer and Dr. Deonita Damons, a recruitment specialist at Boston's City Campus. To both of you, thanks very much for your time this morning. In fact, Dr. Damons, I want to begin with you this morning because, you know, there's so many statistics around how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected women, particularly in the workplace. In fact, there's an interesting PriceWaterhouseCoopers Women in Work Index. It gives some worrying statistics about how women have been impacted by the pandemic. In one part, setting us back in the workplace by at least a generation. How long before we understand the full impact?
I don't believe we'll understand it immediately. It will take us some time to properly investigate the impact that it has had for women in this year, previous year, and in following years. Within April last year, by April last year, we lost 3 million jobs. Of the 3 million jobs, 2 million of those jobs were occupied by women. And that obviously is a significant loss of female within the labor force itself. The biggest thing is, and what we need to look at is how we're going to reintegrate that woman back into the labor force post the pandemic, because we're not even sure when the pandemic is going to come to a natural end as well.
Yeah. Dr. Meyer, in terms of employment trends, there's a lot of sort of analysis that will say pre-COVID-19 we were making some headway in terms of employment and women, more women in senior management positions, more women in JSE-listed companies, and so on. How has the COVID-19 impacted those kinds of trends?
Well, I think it's obvious that we've been set back disproportionately, 5% at least in terms of the job losses that we've experienced is directly because of the pandemic. So when we look at the global trend, we must see that there is a misogynistic and patriarchal element in terms of how we look at the job losses that are being experienced, because women historically were in positions that are primarily in sectors that have been highly impacted. So if we look at hospitality, for example, if we look at the service sector positions, those positions are predominantly taken by women, and this has a very negative effect on them when we look at the workforce.
Yeah. As a recruitment specialist, you know, if I had to leave my job because of various impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, my children being at home, and I make the decision to then stay home during this particular period of the pandemic, how likely is it that I can get back on my career path and continue on, if I wasn't on an upward trajectory, continue on that trajectory?
Well, I think one first has to determine what education level you have and whether reskilling or upskilling is going to be a factor that I have to take into account in terms of employment. The difficulty is that at this current stage, we don't have an idea of how many of those women that may have lost their jobs need upskilling, and if they were adequately educated by the time they lost their employment. So the whole question would be, are you suitably educated or skilled for the position you're applying for? And would you be requiring reskilling because of the advancement made in business, possibly due to the pandemic as well, because most businesses decided to go digital and online. Did you have the skill before COVID? And if not, now you would need the skill post-COVID. And I think those are programs that need to be put in place to ensure that when women go back into the workplace, they're adequately equipped and skilled to reintegrate back into employment.
So the trends that we're seeing here in South Africa and around the world, I mean, it's interesting to look at other countries, but of course, the demographic is so different. all women impacted in terms of employment trends in the wake of COVID-19, but in particular, the biggest impact, women in senior management positions, working mothers, heavily impacted as well, and of course, black women, the worst affected by the kinds of statistics that we are seeing. Dr. Meyer, in terms of how we now mold our response to what's unfolded over the past 16 to 18 months, where do we even begin as government?
So I think that we need to start setting policies around supporting women reintegrating back into the workplace. This is just a microcosm of the larger problem that we sit with in women in the workplace, because at the moment women are 1.8 times more vulnerable in losing their positions than their male counterparts. We also know that if we look at the global statistics in terms of pay parity, for example, which is something, we can't just look at the isolated event of COVID-19 and the impact on that. We have to look at the labor economic situation in its totality and start addressing those gaps. So, for example, going into COVID, we were sitting 19th in the world in terms of pay parity. And what does this mean for us? It means that it will take 257 years for us to close the gap in terms of earning equal pay. So as we move forward, emerging out of the pandemic, what are these systemic issues that you refer to that we need to put in place? What are the policy directives that we need to put in place? There needs to be incentives. First of all, economic growth equals job opportunity. So we can't be isolated and not look at the situation pragmatically. So we need to ensure that there is investment, economic growth is stimulated, that we continue on the trajectory of ensuring that corruption is curbed at all costs, that there are, for example, subsidies put in place for women in small emerging businesses that emerge, also incentivizing employers to ensure that they have equal parity in terms of the workforce, to ensure that there's a 50-50 split and that women are paid fairly and equitably because they carry the burden and the brunt of what happens within the labor economy, not just by the work that they do, but the residual elements that they have to take care of. Childcare, homeschooling, all of these other things that predominantly fall on the shoulders of women.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no overstating, Dr. Damons, what it would mean for a country, for the social fabric of a country to empower in this way. I don't know about you, but I'm not going to wait 257 years to close the gender pay gap.
No, that is true. And the unfortunate thing is it boils down to so many women, not just in senior positions, but also in the informal sector, that we don't account for because we don't know how many of them are in the informal sector. It's difficult to put a number to that. They are also so disadvantaged because apart from informal, they're not recognized, they don't get access to benefits, they're not adequately skilled. And when they do enter the workforce at some stage, they're put at the disadvantage because they come in at the bottom of the feeding scheme, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Meyer, is there enough of a focus, you know, we always term it, is there enough political will? We know what the gaps are in terms of employment opportunities for women, just in terms of what Dr. Damons has just outlined. But is there enough of a will to address it and to do so speedily?
Well, I think we have some of the best labour policies and legislation in the world. But when we speak about political will, it's not just about what we reflect on as politicians, but it's about corporate will and how, as a sector, we hold these corporates accountable. If only 2 of the top 100 listed companies in South Africa have female CEOs, if we look at the disproportionate reflection of female representation on boards, how we sit back and accept that, just blindly accept that we are supporting organizations that are not taking the plight of women seriously and the advancement of women seriously. As a society, we need to start reflecting more critically on what it is that we put in as acceptable. So we can have the best legislation, policy, and everything else in the world, unless as a society we stand back and hold corporate organizations to account, as we have in government. And we've seen this huge turnaround in the government sector. We will never turn the scourge on what is required for us to have a normalized and equal society.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Damons, your final comments insofar as, corporate South Africa's responsibility, because we always talk about the role of government, as we should do, but corporate South Africa's responsibility insofar as women in top manager positions, in CEO positions, but also in terms of what the corporate world gives back to South Africa in terms of creating employment opportunities for the women of the country.
Well, I think, first of all, one shouldn't discard the fact that it is corporate South Africa that provides employment opportunities. And they somehow have a blanket, or they have carte blanche in terms of the policies that they enforce in terms of employment as well. But because there's no, I don't want to call it a punitive measure, whereby they are enforced or forced to elevate the role of women within the workplace, it doesn't seem like there is a necessary aim or objective to increase the number of women in senior positions. And it boils down to whether there is legislation. Are we going to add punitive measures to such legislation? I don't think that is sound at the moment, but it seems like it most likely is going to be the only option eventually. If we want to see the parity that Dr. Meyer is referring to.
Yeah, absolutely. But to both of our guests, that's the time we have for this discussion, and we could go on for another hour at least. Thank you so much for your time on this Women's Day edition of the show. COVID-19 and gender inequality in the workplace. It's going to be an ongoing discussion over the next months and years post-pandemic. Dr. Deonita Damons is Career and Recruitment Specialist at Boston City Campus, and Dr. Linda Meyer, HR Specialist and former CCMA Commissioner. Thanks very much indeed.